A major strategic shift is taking shape in the Pacific, and Tokyo is moving far faster than many outside the region seem to realize. While global attention has remained fixed on Ukraine, Gaza, and the broader Middle East, East Asia has been hardening into a far more dangerous theater. The security triangle linking China, Russia, and Japan is no longer defined by symbolic warnings or distant planning documents. It is becoming operational, technological, and immediate. At the center of that shift is Japan, a state that for decades treated military restraint as part of its post-war identity, but is now building capabilities that would have once been politically unthinkable. One example captures the pace of that change. On the deck of a Japanese test vessel, engineers are preparing a 100-kilowatt class high-energy laser system housed in containerized modules. The logic behind it is brutally simple. In a future war, especially one centered on Taiwan, China is expected to use mass drone swarms, missile saturation, and relentless electronic disruption to overwhelm conventional defenses. Traditional interceptors can stop some of those threats, but they are expensive, finite, and slow to replace. A directed energy weapon changes the equation because it can engage targets at the cost of electricity rather than multi-million-dollar missiles. In the arithmetic of modern war, that matters enormously. This is why Japan's laser development has drawn so much attention. The system is not just a flashy technological milestone, it reflects a deeper redesign of Japanese military thinking. The question Tokyo is now asking is no longer whether the regional threat environment has worsened. That debate is over. The real question is how quickly Japan can field the tools needed to survive and shape a conflict that may begin with thousands of simultaneous attacks across air, sea, cyber, and space domains. To understand why Japan is moving this way, one has to begin with Beijing's position on Taiwan. China's leadership has repeatedly made clear that unification with Taiwan is not treated as a negotiable side issue, but as a central element of national rejuvenation. Beijing's timeline language may vary, but the strategic direction has been consistent for years. It has expanded missile forces, hardened bases, built up naval power, modernized amphibious capabilities, and sharpened operational planning for scenarios involving coercion or invasion across the Taiwan Strait. Western military planners have spent years studying what such an opening phase could look like. The most sobering assessments share one core assumption. The first stage of a major Taiwan conflict would likely not begin with troops on beaches. It would begin with a massive, coordinated strike campaign. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, cyber operations, electronic warfare, and attacks on communications infrastructure would be used to blind, isolate, and paralyze the island before large-scale maritime operations even begin. The aim would be to make organized defense collapse faster than foreign powers could respond. Taiwan has been trying to adapt to that reality. Its force structure is shifting toward distributed defense, coastal anti-ship firepower, rapid local response, and systems designed to operate even if central command nodes come under attack. Harpoon coastal defense systems, decentralized firing authority, and greater emphasis on survivability all reflect the same conclusion. The first hours of a conflict will be chaos, and only forces prepared to fight through that chaos will matter. But Taiwan is only one part of the picture. Japan is watching the same scenario and drawing a broader lesson. If Beijing tries to seize Taiwan quickly, Tokyo will not be a distant observer. The geography makes that impossible. Japan's southwestern islands sit close to the theater. Sea lanes, air routes, American bases, and Japanese territory would all be directly implicated. In strategic terms, the defense of Taiwan and the defense of Japan are no longer easily separable. That southern pressure is only one side of Japan's problem. The northern pressure is coming from Russia. Moscow has made a habit of reminding Tokyo that Japan lies inside Russia's long-range strike envelope. Nuclear-capable bomber patrols over the Sea of Japan are part of that signaling pattern. These flights are not just routine military aviation. They are political messages delivered through flight paths and weapons range. Aircraft such as the Tu-95MS do not need to enter Japanese airspace to create pressure. Their cruise missiles can threaten targets across Japan while remaining outside direct engagement zones. That is what makes the patrols so effective as coercive theater. They stop just short of direct confrontation while still advertising what could come next. For Japan, that creates a uniquely difficult strategic reality. China is the primary military concern in the south, especially around Taiwan and the East China Sea. Russia is the nuclear-armed pressure source to the north, using long-range patrols, territorial friction, and broader military signaling. Tokyo is not confronting a single-axis threat. It is confronting a layered environment in which two major powers can stretch its planning simultaneously. Russia's underwater deterrence signaling adds another dimension. The development of the Poseidon nuclear torpedo system, an autonomous underwater weapon concept designed to threaten coastlines rather than just ships, has intensified concern across the Pacific. Its significance lies not only in the warhead estimates often discussed in public debate, but in what the system represents strategically: a weapon built to create fear through catastrophic coastal vulnerability. Even if deployment remains limited and technically complex, the message to regional adversaries is unmistakable. Moscow wants potential interveners to imagine not just military losses, but civilizational-scale destruction. Japan's answer to this two-front environment has not been rhetorical alarm. It has been a structural defense transformation. For decades, Japan's post-war security model operated within strict political and constitutional limits. Defense spending hovered around 1% of GDP. Offensive strike capability remained politically sensitive. Military modernization existed, but within boundaries meant to preserve the image of Japan as a self-restrained defensive power. That framework is now being revised in substance, even where the legal language remains more careful. Defense spending has surged, and the symbolic break is enormous. Moving toward 2% of GDP is not just a budget line, it marks the end of an old psychological ceiling. More important is what the money is buying. Japan is not merely expanding personnel or refurbishing legacy platforms. It is investing in long-range strike systems, missile defense, hypersonic programs, advanced naval firepower, directed energy weapons, and the industrial foundation required for prolonged competition. The Tomahawk purchase from the United States is one of the clearest examples. These cruise missiles give Japan a standoff strike capability that it historically lacked. This matters because it changes the operational equation. A state that can reach hundreds of miles outward and hold enemy launch sites or logistics nodes at risk is no longer confined to absorbing blows. It gains a form of counterstrike potential that complicates enemy planning from the outset. Tokyo's domestically developed missile programs push the same logic further. Improved Type 12 variants, including longer-range land, sea, and submarine-based versions, point toward a future in which Japan can shape engagement zones far beyond its immediate coastline. This is especially important in the island chains stretching southwest toward Taiwan, where geography favors whoever can layer anti-ship, anti-air, and precision strike capability across maritime choke points. Then there are the hypersonic and electromagnetic projects. Japan's railgun efforts and hypersonic glide-related programs are still developing, but their direction is highly revealing. Tokyo is clearly trying to prepare for a battle space in which incoming threats may be faster, harder to intercept, and too numerous for legacy missile defense architectures alone. A destroyer equipped in the future with railgun capability, high-energy lasers, and advanced interceptors would represent not incremental modernization, but a new combat philosophy, one built around sustainability under saturation attack. This is where the laser system becomes especially important. Missile defense has a scaling problem. If the attacker can launch large numbers of relatively cheap drones or lower-cost strike systems, the defender may spend vastly more per interception than the attacker spends per target. Over time, that becomes an attritional trap. A laser is attractive because it reduces the cost per engagement and can keep firing as long as power, cooling, and targeting conditions are maintained. It is not a universal solution. Weather, range, dwell time, and target type all matter. But as part of a layered defense architecture, it could become a critical answer to mass attacks. In practical terms, that means a future Chinese saturation campaign would face a different defensive landscape than it would have several years ago. Missiles might still get through. Drones would still be dangerous. Electronic warfare would still complicate everything. But the defender would no longer be relying solely on expensive kinetic interceptors. That lowers the probability that the attacking side can simply exhaust its opponent through volume. And Japan is not building this architecture alone. The United States remains the anchor of the Pacific balance, and the alliance with Japan is being translated into increasingly concrete military geometry. American forces on Okinawa and across the First Island chain are designed to make Chinese maritime expansion far costlier in a crisis. Anti-ship missile units, integrated air and missile defense, and the wider American naval and air presence all reinforce Japan's own buildup. This is no longer just about treaty language. It is about overlapping denial zones. Japan's southwestern islands are central to that concept. Missiles deployed on islands close to Taiwan create a defensive lattice that narrows the corridor through which Chinese air and naval forces would need to move. Add American systems, airborne surveillance, submarines, and maritime patrol assets, and the regional map begins to look less like open ocean and more like a series of contested gates. This is also why cooperation among the region's democracies has become more significant than at any point in decades. Australia has moved deeper into hard balancing, both through its own force modernization and through defense industrial cooperation with Japan and the United States. The AUKUS framework is part of that. So is Australia's interest in naval expansion and greater regional interoperability. South Korea, despite its difficult historical relationship with Japan, is also moving in a more strategically aligned direction as the threat environment worsens. Even the Philippines, long more hesitant and strategically inconsistent, has been strengthening its security posture in ways that matter for the maritime balance. The deeper significance of this trend is that China's rise and Russia's coercive signaling may have accelerated the regional alignment they most wanted to prevent. The more pressure authoritarian powers apply, the more incentive neighboring democracies have to coordinate. That does not erase historical mistrust or domestic political friction, but it does create a strategic gravity that keeps pulling them closer together. From Beijing's perspective, the real danger is time. China's military planning has long depended on speed. If force is used against Taiwan, the objective would not be to fight a long, grinding regional war if that could be avoided. The logic would be to create facts on the ground, or at sea and in the air, before outside intervention becomes decisive. That means overwhelming pressure early, fast suppression of Taiwanese defenses, rapid political shock, and the creation of a new status quo before Japan and the United States can fully mobilize a coordinated response. But that window narrows as regional defenses grow denser. Every new Japanese missile battery, every integrated radar and air defense node, every anti-ship deployment in the island chain, every new alliance mechanism, every hardening measure in Taiwan, and every experimental system that moves closer to operational use makes the initial assault model less certain. The more uncertainty China faces about how quickly it could secure military objectives, the more dangerous the calculus becomes. A plan built on rapid success becomes much riskier if the defender can stretch the timeline from hours into days and from days into weeks. That is one reason wargaming around Taiwan remains so sobering. Even when outside intervention can prevent a successful invasion, the costs to all sides are extreme. War in this region would not look clean, surgical, or containable. It would involve devastating naval losses, air attrition, attacks on infrastructure, disrupted trade, severe economic shock, and the genuine possibility of escalation into domains that have not been tested at that scale in modern history. Japan's current buildup is essentially a recognition that surviving such a conflict would require far greater depth than the old pacifist-era structure ever allowed. There is also a technological contest underway beyond visible weapons platforms. China is not preparing only missiles and ships. It is also studying communications infrastructure, electronic vulnerabilities, undersea cable networks, and the weak points of Allied command and control systems. A war would likely begin with attempts to blind, confuse, and fragment the defender before physical destruction reached its peak. That is why Taiwan's recent training has placed such emphasis on deception, ambiguity, and early-stage gray zone confusion, including the use of civilian-looking maritime activity to disguise military preparation. Japan understands that the future fight may begin before a formal war begins. In such a scenario, the distinction between peace and conflict erodes quickly. Commercial ships, drones, cyber disruptions, electronic interference, and coordinated probe actions become part of the opening campaign. A military system built only for declared war arrives too late. Tokyo's current defense reforms suggest it now grasps that reality. Russia's role in this environment is more complex than simply serving as Beijing's northern partner. Since the invasion of Ukraine, Japan has become one of the more consistent Asian supporters of the Western response to Moscow. That has consequences. Russian bomber patrols, nuclear signaling, and ongoing territorial tension over the Kuril Islands function as reminders that Tokyo is exposed not only because of China, but because of its wider strategic alignment. Moscow is effectively telling Japan that support for Ukraine is not cost-free in East Asia. At the same time, Russia's own military-industrial constraints matter. Sanctions, battlefield demands, and technology bottlenecks complicate parts of its strategic modernization agenda. That does not make Moscow harmless. it does mean that some of its most dramatic military programs should be understood as both real capabilities and political messaging tools. The distinction matters, but from Tokyo's point of view, the conclusion is the same. Japan must prepare for coercion under conditions where multiple adversaries may test it in different ways. What makes this moment so consequential is that Japan's transformation no longer appears temporary or reactive. It is becoming institutional. The current buildup runs on a multi-year timeline and points toward a force structure that looks fundamentally different from the Japan of the late 20th century. Joint development of next-generation fighters with European partners, missile integration on naval platforms, island-based defensive networks, advanced naval weapons research, and closer alliance interoperability all indicate permanence. This is not a brief panic cycle. Japan is redesigning itself as a frontline military power within a democratic coalition across the Indo-Pacific. That coalition is still incomplete, and that is part of the danger. Deterrence takes time to build. Windows of vulnerability can exist precisely while deterrence is improving, but not yet fully mature. In strategic terms, that can produce a paradox. The stronger Japan, Taiwan, and their partners become over time, the more a revisionist power may feel pressure to act before the balance turns even less favorable. In other words, the very process of building deterrence can sharpen the urgency on the other side. That is what makes the Pacific so dangerous right now. The region is not simply arming in a stable equilibrium. It is racing through a period of transition in which new weapons, new doctrines, and new alignments are arriving faster than the political order can absorb them. China sees a narrowing opportunity around Taiwan. Japan sees a shrinking margin for passivity. The United States sees the need to reinforce the first island chain before deterrence credibility frays. Russia sees a chance to complicate Japan's choices through northern pressure and nuclear signaling. All of these actors are responding rationally to their own threat perceptions. That is what makes the situation so unstable. Japan's laser program, then, is not just about a beam weapon on a ship. It is a symbol of a broader shift in strategic thought. Tokyo is preparing for a future in which wars may be decided not only by who has the most missiles, but by who can sustain defense under saturation, integrate new technologies faster, and deny the attacker a quick, decisive opening. In that future, the side that can keep functioning under immense pressure may be the side that prevails. The Pacific balance is being rewritten in real time. Japan is spending more, reaching farther, coordinating more deeply, and testing systems that would once have seemed incompatible with its political identity. Beijing and Moscow are watching that change with increasing concern, because it suggests the region they hope to intimidate is becoming harder, smarter, and more militarily coherent. That does not guarantee peace, but it does mean the next crisis in East Asia will unfold in a much more heavily armed and technologically dense environment than the one policymakers knew even a few years ago. And that is exactly why the region now matters far more than the headlines suggest.